My wealthy parents left me $1 in their will. Grandpa left me something they never expected. My parents left me $1 in their will, and my mother made sure the attorney read the reason out loud. She called it a final acknowledgement of the daughter who had chosen disloyalty over family. My brother Adrian lowered his eyes with the careful solemnity he used whenever he wanted people to mistake satisfaction for grief. My sister Camille stared openly, waiting for me to break. Around us, the conference room windows reflected a gray November sky and the black clothes of relatives who had come less to mourn than to witness the last distribution of the Vale family fortune. I did not cry. I did not argue. I signed the receipt for the dollar, slid the coin into my coat pocket, and thanked the attorney. That composure bothered my siblings more than anger would have. They believed I had just learned I was poor. What they did not know was that, 3 nights before the reading, a woman from my grandfather's law firm had placed an old leather ledger in front of me and explained that nearly everything Adrian and Camille were celebrating rested on property they did not own, debt they could not repay, and voting rights our parents had spent 30 years pretending did not exist. My name is Evelyn Vale, and in my family, money was never simply money. It was affection measured in square footage, obedience converted into trust funds, and silence rewarded with shares. By the time I was 8, I understood that my parents did not ask whether their children were kind or honest. They asked whether we were useful to the image they were building. Vale Meridian began as a regional manufacturer of commercial refrigeration systems. My grandfather, Arthur Bell, had designed a compressor that used less energy than anything else available in the late 1980s. He had no talent for marketing and no interest in becoming famous. My mother, Vivian, had inherited his intelligence but none of his restraint. She married my father, Richard Vale, a polished salesman with an instinct for finding the most profitable version of every story. Together they transformed 1 patent, 1 factory, and 60 acres of my grandfather's land into an international company. Newspapers called my parents visionary founders. Magazine profiles described grandfather as an early investor who had stepped away. At family events, my father joked that Arthur preferred tractors to boardrooms. Grandfather would smile faintly and let the lie pass. I assumed he was indifferent. I learned much later that he had been keeping records. Adrian was born first and treated like an heir before he could spell the word. Camille arrived 2 years later and learned that beauty could function as currency. I was the youngest, unexpected and inconvenient, but for a while my parents found a role for me. I was the quiet one, the serious one, the daughter who could be placed beside donors at dinner and trusted not to spill anything, including family secrets. I spent more time with grandfather than either of my siblings did. His home stood beyond the original factory on land covered with maple trees and waist-high grass. While Adrian attended leadership camps and Camille trained for equestrian competitions, I sat at Arthur's scarred kitchen table, drawing imaginary buildings on the backs of engineering diagrams. He taught me that ownership was not the same as possession. He showed me boundary maps, patent filings, loan documents, and the difference between a promise made in public and an obligation written in ink. At 12, I thought these were lessons about business. At 34, I understood they had been warnings. My break with my parents began 6 years before their deaths, when Vale Meridian was preparing to launch a line of compact cooling units for hospitals and pharmaceutical laboratories. I was 30 then, a compliance director who had earned her position despite my last name, not because of it. I had studied mechanical engineering, then regulatory law, and had deliberately worked for another manufacturer before joining the family company. My father liked to mention my credentials at conferences. My mother liked them less when I used them. During final testing, my team found that a pressure valve supplied by a new vendor could fail under sustained heat. The probability looked small on paper, but failure could cause coolant contamination and destroy temperature-sensitive medicine. I recommended delaying the launch and replacing the valves. The delay would cost approximately $12 million and embarrass Adrian, who had negotiated the vendor contract and tied his promotion to an aggressive release date. My parents ordered me to revise the report. They did not phrase it as fraud. Families like mine rarely used honest words for ugly things. My mother said the data required context. My father said leadership meant balancing theoretical risk against real-world consequences. Adrian said competitors would use any delay to damage us. Camille, who ran public relations despite having no relevant training, reminded me that thousands of employees depended on our judgment. I refused to sign the certification. Over the next month, the pressure became personal. My office was moved away from the executive floor. Projects disappeared from my calendar. People who had once copied me on every decision stopped meeting my eyes. My father invited me to dinner and spoke for 2 hours about sacrifice, family legacy, and my tendency to confuse rigidity with morality. My mother finally said what all of them meant. If I blocked the launch, I would no longer be considered part of the family. I reported the defect to the Independent Safety Committee and resigned. The launch was postponed. A later inspection found additional faults in the vendor's facility, validating everything my team had documented. No patients were harmed. Vail Meridian paid a penalty for incomplete disclosures, but the company survived. Publicly, my parents praised the strength of their internal controls. Privately, they erased me. They removed my photograph from the company history wall. Invitations stopped. My access to the family home was canceled. Camille told mutual friends I had suffered a breakdown caused by professional jealousy. Adrian suggested I had tried to sabotage the company because he had been chosen as the future chief executive. My parents did not merely cut contact, they constructed a version of events in which abandoning me was an act of protection. The strategy worked because wealth makes repetition sound like evidence. I rebuilt my life in another city. I joined a consulting firm that investigated manufacturing failures, then opened a small practice with 2 former colleagues. We were not glamorous, but we were good. Within 3 years, we had helped companies prevent recalls, rebuild compliance systems, and identify fraud hidden behind optimistic executive summaries. I bought a modest brick townhouse, adopted an elderly black dog named June, and learned that dinner could be peaceful when nobody was using it to rank the people at the table. Grandfather stayed in contact. He never asked me to forgive my parents, and he never pretended neutrality was virtue. He said he had failed by allowing Vivian and Richard to confuse stewardship with entitlement. Still, he did not publicly challenge them. At first, that hurt. Then his health declined, and our conversations shifted toward ordinary things: the condition of his orchard, the books he was reading, whether June had finally stopped stealing socks. I did not know that he was dismantling my parents' control, one document at a time. My parents died together when their car crossed the center line during a winter storm. The news reached me through a business alert before any relative called. A photograph of their crushed sedan appeared beneath a headline describing the loss of 2 industrial icons. For several minutes, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the image and feeling nothing I could name. Grief is difficult when love and harm share the same face. I remembered my mother brushing my hair before school and my father teaching me to ride a bicycle. I also remembered the unsigned safety report on his desk and my mother's voice telling me that integrity was a luxury purchased by people who did not carry responsibility. I mourned the parents they had once been, the parents I had needed, and the reconciliation they had made impossible. None of those griefs canceled the others. Adrian's assistant emailed funeral details. There was no personal message. I attended because absence would have allowed my family to narrate it for me. The memorial filled the glass atrium at Vail Meridian headquarters. Giant screens displayed my parents touring factories, opening charitable clinics, and smiling with politicians. I appeared in exactly 1 childhood photograph, half hidden behind Camille. Adrian delivered a speech about continuity. Camille spoke about devotion. Neither acknowledged me. Grandfather sat in the front row in a wheelchair, smaller than I remembered, but alert. When I approached him after the service, he held my hand for a long time. Then he asked me to visit him the following morning. I found him in his study with his attorney, Miriam Shaw. The room smelled of cedar, dust, and the peppermint tea he had consumed for decades. A leather ledger lay on the desk beside 3 sealed folders. Arthur did not waste time offering comfort he knew could not be simple. He told me my parents' wills would humiliate me. He knew because my mother had sent him a copy 2 years earlier, hoping he would mirror her plan. Adrian would receive 45% of my parents' Vail Meridian shares, the Lake Estate, and their interest in a private aviation partnership. Camille would receive 45% of the shares, the Manhattan apartment, jewelry, art, and investment accounts. 10% of the shares would go to a charitable foundation controlled jointly by Adrian and Camille. I would receive $1. There was also a letter explaining that token. Grandfather's expression hardened as he described it. My parents wanted their rejection to survive them. They believed a public wound would serve as a warning to anyone inside the company who placed rules above loyalty. Then Miriam opened the leather ledger. The story the world knew about Vail Meridian began with my parents. The story in the ledger began 7 years earlier. Arthur had created the original compressor, purchased the factory acreage, and formed Bell Industrial Holdings. When Vivian and Richard proposed expanding the business, he licensed the patent to their new corporation and leased them the land for 99 years. He also advanced their seed capital through a secured note. The agreements were generous but precise. Bell Industrial retained ownership of the land beneath the original factory, the research campus, the distribution hub, and the headquarters my parents built later. It retained a special class of voting shares equal to 51% on matters involving sale, merger, debt above a defined threshold, executive appointments, and changes to the company's safety charter. The loan balance, adjusted under terms my father had repeatedly extended instead of repaying, had grown to more than $140 million. My parents had disclosed pieces of this structure in buried filings, but they behaved as if grandfather would never enforce it. Analysts valued the company based on visible operations. Adrian and Camille grew up assuming the shares they would inherit meant control. In reality, their wealth depended on Arthur continuing to choose patience. He was finished being patient. 3 years earlier, he had transferred Bell Industrial Holdings into the Bell Stewardship Trust. The trust's purpose was not to enrich a favorite descendant. It was to preserve the company, protect employees, and prevent the family from selling assets built through public subsidies and worker concessions merely to finance private excess. After reviewing my conduct during the Valve investigation, Arthur had named me successor trustee and sole voting steward. When he died, I would control Bell Industrial's land, debt, patents still producing royalties, and special voting shares. I would receive a personal inheritance as well, but the real power came with restrictions. I could not liquidate the holdings for my own benefit. I could enforce the debt, renegotiate leases, replace executives, or approve a sale only if an independent panel determined the action protected the company's long-term stability. It was not a crown. It was a responsibility sharpened into a blade. Grandfather asked whether I wanted it. I remember looking at his hands, thin and veined against the ledger. Part of me wanted to refuse. I had built a life beyond the Vale family, and accepting any role risked being dragged back into the machinery I had escaped. Another part of me understood why he had chosen me. Adrian viewed the company as proof of his importance. Camille viewed it as a source of status. My parents had viewed it as an extension of themselves. I was the only one who had once sacrificed my place in it to protect people whose names I did not know. I told him I would accept, but not as revenge. He nodded and said revenge was expensive because it required allowing the people who hurt us to remain the center of our decisions. Stewardship required something colder and more useful, attention to consequences. He died 9 days later. By then, the date for my parents' will reading had already been set. Miriam advised me that Arthur's documents would not be presented until the following week because his trust required confirmation from 2 independent fiduciaries. She also warned me not to reveal anything early. Vale Meridian's board needed to preserve records, lenders needed notice, and my siblings needed the opportunity to make decisions without tailoring their behavior to the power they assumed I held. That last point proved more valuable than any surprise. At my parents' reading, Adrian and Camille performed grief until the assets were announced. Then relief softened their faces. Adrian immediately asked about transferring voting proxies. Camille wanted keys to the apartment and an inventory of the jewelry. When the attorney reached my bequest, he paused as though hoping someone would stop him. No one did. He read my mother's letter. It described me as intelligent but morally vain, a daughter who had betrayed the family during a vulnerable period and refused every opportunity for reconciliation. The $1, she wrote, represented the exact value of blood without loyalty. The room remained silent for a moment after he finished. Then an aunt I barely knew exhaled through her nose, almost a laugh. Camille watched me with bright, hungry curiosity. Adrian adopted a pained expression and said he hoped the finality would allow all of us to heal. His version of healing required me to accept the wound quietly so he could feel generous for witnessing it. I signed the receipt. Camille followed me into the hallway. She wore our mother's pearl earrings even though the estate had not released them. She said she could arrange a small payment if I agreed not to challenge the will or speak to the press. The offer was framed as compassion, but her attorney had clearly warned her that a public dispute could delay distributions. I told her I had no intention of contesting our parents' wishes. That was true. I did not need their estate. She mistook truth for surrender and smiled. Over the next 6 days, my siblings demonstrated exactly what grandfather feared. Adrian convened Vale Meridian's board and announced himself as interim chief executive before probate had transferred a single share. He ordered the finance team to explore a special dividend that would move $80 million from company reserves to shareholders. Most of that money would flow to him and Camille once the estate closed. Camille hired a luxury auction house to value our mother's art, then used the expected inheritance as collateral for a loan to purchase a hotel in Saint-Tropez. She also instructed the family foundation to fund a new cultural center bearing our parents' names. The proposed center was owned by a development partnership in which she held an undisclosed interest. Together, they planned to sell the original factory acreage to a logistics company, outsource production, and terminate nearly 1,100 employees. The sale would generate cash for the dividend and improve short-term earnings before they offered Vale Meridian to a private equity consortium. They made these plans in less than a week. The board's general counsel, a careful man named Samuel Ortiz, sent Miriam copies of the resolutions because each proposal triggered Bell Industrial's consent rights. Adrian apparently believed those rights had expired. My father had circulated an internal memo years earlier claiming the special shares would be retired upon Arthur's death. No executed agreement supported that claim. I spent those days reading. The leather ledger was only an index. Behind it stood warehouses of decisions, leases, amendments, safety covenants, environmental reports, pension obligations, patent assignments, and correspondence showing that my parents had repeatedly acknowledged Arthur's control when they needed more time or money. Their signatures appeared beneath promises they later pretended had never been made. I also met the people grandfather had selected for the independent stewardship panel, a retired labor judge, a former plant manager, and an economist who specialized in family-controlled companies. None had personal ties to me. That mattered. Arthur had designed the trust so I could not use it as a private weapon, even if anger tempted me. The panel's first report was devastating. Vale Meridian remained profitable, but my parents had hidden significant weakness beneath growth. Adrian's vendor strategy had increased warranty claims. Camille's branding projects had consumed tens of millions without measurable return. Executive aircraft, residences, sponsorships, and family offices were billed through subsidiaries. The proposed dividend would breach lending covenants. The factory sale would trigger pension liabilities large enough to erase most of the proceeds. My siblings had inherited the appearance of wealth and the habits that could destroy it. Arthur's trust reading took place on a Monday morning in the same conference room where I had received my dollar. This time, only direct beneficiaries, company counsel, and fiduciaries attended. Adrian entered first, impatient and confident. Camille arrived late with a publicist who was asked to wait outside. They assumed grandfather had left them additional money and expected my presence to provide another opportunity for comparison. Miriam began with personal bequests. Arthur left his house to a historical conservation organization, his engineering papers to a university, and specific gifts to longtime employees and caregivers. Adrian received his grandfather's first toolbox. Camille received a collection of family photographs. Each gift came with a short note about remembering what work and family actually meant. I received the contents of Arthur's personal investment account, valued at a little over $18 million. Camille's face changed first. Before she could object, Miriam continued. She described the Bell Stewardship Trust, its assets, restrictions, and succession terms. The numbers were not dramatic until connected. 60 acres beneath Vale Meridian's central operations, royalty interests across 23 countries, a secured note worth $143 million, 51% special voting control over defined corporate actions, additional reserves and municipal bonds, bringing the trust's estimated value to $312 million. Then Miriam named me successor trustee and voting steward. Adrian laughed. It was not amusement. It was the involuntary sound of a man rejecting reality before reality could reject him. He said the structure was obsolete. Samuel placed the original share certificate and recent legal opinions on the table. Adrian said our father had canceled the note. Miriam produced 6 renewal agreements signed by Richard, the most recent 18 months earlier. Camille said the land must belong to Vale Meridian because the company had paid property taxes. The leases explicitly treated those payments as additional rent. Each objection had been anticipated decades before they made it. My siblings turned toward me only after attacking the documents failed. Their expressions asked the same question in different ways. What was I going to do to them? I told them the trust would review the proposed dividend, factory sale, executive appointment, and any change of control. Until that review concluded, none could proceed. Existing operations would continue, employees would be paid, customers would see no interruption. Adrian demanded that I approve his appointment immediately. I declined. Camille accused me of manipulating grandfather while he was ill. Miriam responded with medical capacity evaluations recorded every 6 months for 4 years, plus video statements Arthur had made without me present. The thoroughness of his preparation made their accusations look smaller each time they spoke. I slid my parents' dollar onto the table. I said I did not need it, but I intended to keep it because it reminded me how badly intelligent people could miscalculate value. That was the only theatrical thing I allowed myself. Outside the building, reporters waited. Someone from Camille's circle had leaked the size of my personal inheritance, but not the trust structure. Questions followed me across the pavement. Had Arthur disinherited the others because of a family feud? Would I challenge my parents' will? Had I secretly returned to Vale Meridian? I said the trusts were private, and that the company would issue accurate information when legally appropriate. Then I went home and fed June. The war began the next morning. Adrian filed an emergency petition claiming Arthur lacked capacity and had been subjected to undue influence. Camille's publicist planted stories describing me as an estranged daughter who had exploited an isolated old man. Anonymous sources resurrected claims that I had caused the valve crisis for personal reasons. Photographs of my townhouse appeared online beside estimates of my new wealth, as if modesty before inheritance proved deception rather than independence. My siblings expected shame to make me retreat. That was the method our parents had used: define resistance as instability, then punish the target for reacting. I did not respond publicly. Miriam answered the petition with documentation. My consulting partners released my work history only after clients began receiving calls. The former members of my compliance team provided statements confirming the valve defect and the pressure we had faced. More importantly, Vale Meridian's lenders intervened. They did not care about family mythology. They cared that Adrian had attempted to authorize a dividend likely to violate covenants while his authority was disputed. The court denied his emergency request and scheduled a full hearing. Inside the company, Adrian behaved as if volume could replace legitimacy. He occupied my father's office, instructed staff to address him as chief executive, and removed Samuel from key meetings. The board, composed largely of my parents' friends, hesitated to challenge him. Several directors had received consulting fees through related entities. Others assumed the family dispute would settle and wanted to stand beside the apparent winner. The stewardship panel recommended a temporary independent chief executive and a forensic audit. Under the special shares, I had authority to require both. I appointed Lena Brooks, who had run Vale Meridian's European operations before leaving after a conflict with Adrian. She was disciplined, respected by plant employees, and uninterested in becoming part of our family drama. Her first act was to freeze non-essential related party payments. Her second was to preserve executive email servers. Within 48 hours, Camille called me. She began softly, invoking childhood. She mentioned the blanket fort we had built during a thunderstorm when I was 6, and the summer she taught me to swim. Those memories were real, which made their use crueler. Then she shifted to the practical matter. If I approved the dividend and recognized Adrian, they would end the lawsuit. Camille would even give me our mother's sapphire necklace, an object she believed should matter to me more than governance. I asked whether she had disclosed her interest in the Saint-Tropez development to the foundation board. The silence answered. I told her all related party transactions were under review and ended the call. The forensic audit revealed that my parents had spent years using company resources to maintain a private kingdom. Some expenses were legal but excessive. Others crossed clear lines. Vale Meridian had paid for renovations to the lake estate, salaries for household staff, and consulting contracts to friends who performed no identifiable work. The family foundation had purchased art from galleries connected to Camille at inflated prices. Adrian's preferred valve supplier was partly owned through a shell company by his college roommate, who had transferred funds into an investment vehicle they shared. The defect I had exposed 6 years earlier had not simply threatened Adrian's promotion, it had threatened a concealed financial arrangement. That discovery changed my grief. I had believed my parents rejected me because they chose the company over me. The truth was meaner. They chose the version of the company that protected their secrets. They had risked medicine, employees, and their own daughter to hide a stream of private benefits. For a week, I slept badly. I reread my mother's letter until every sentence became flat. The phrase, "blood without loyalty," had been designed to define me, but it described them more accurately. Their loyalty extended only toward anyone willing to preserve the machine that fed them. The audit also complicated the inheritance. The shares Adrian and Camille expected were valuable, but not nearly as valuable as the estate inventory suggested. Personal guarantees connected portions of my parents' debt to those shares. Tax obligations were enormous. If the company pursued repayment of misused funds, the estate could lose several headline assets. My siblings responded by escalating. Adrian called an employee town hall without Lena's approval. He stood beneath a banner bearing our parents' portraits and claimed an outsider faction was attempting a hostile takeover. Although he never used my name, everyone knew whom he meant. He promised to defend jobs, even though his own plan required closing the original factory. The contradiction did not matter to him because he assumed employees would never see the documents. I authorized their release. Not confidential audit material, but the resolutions he had signed, the proposed land sale, outsourcing analysis, termination estimates, and special dividend. Lena presented them at a second town hall and explained the independent review. Workers who had applauded Adrian 2 days earlier sat in complete silence. One of them, a maintenance supervisor named Rosa Delgado, approached me afterward. She had worked at the original factory for 27 years. Her husband had died, 2 sons had gone through college, and the pension Adrian treated as a balance sheet inconvenience was the difference between security and dependence. Rosa said grandfather used to walk the floor every Friday and ask what machines management was ignoring. Then she told me he had chosen correctly. Her approval frightened me more than my siblings' attacks. It reminded me that every decision now reached beyond family. I could not enjoy their downfall without also asking who might be crushed underneath it. The trust hearing occurred 6 weeks after Arthur's death. Adrian and Camille filled one side of the courtroom with attorneys. Their argument depended on portraying me as a bitter exile who had cultivated grandfather's resentment. They presented photographs of us together, travel records from my visits, and selected messages in which he criticized my parents. They implied closeness itself was evidence of manipulation. Miriam presented the timeline. Arthur had established the first version of the trust 14 years earlier, long before my estrangement. He had added the stewardship restrictions after witnessing repeated governance failures. He considered 3 professional trustees, 2 universities, and a worker benefit foundation before selecting me. Video recordings showed him explaining both his decision and its risks. In one, he said affection was not the basis of his choice. He chose me because I had already proven willing to lose personal benefit rather than certify a lie. My siblings' attorneys challenged his capacity. 4 physicians confirmed it. An independent judge had interviewed him privately. Annual audits showed he understood every asset. Arthur had not merely prepared for a dispute, he had built a fortress around his intent. Then Adrian took the stand. His own confidence damaged him. He insisted the special shares were meaningless because our father had controlled the company in practice. When asked why Richard had signed repeated debt renewals, Adrian said they were family formalities no one expected to enforce. When asked about the dividend, he called it a normal return to owners. The opposing attorney reminded him that he had not yet legally inherited the shares when he proposed distributing the cash. He admitted he intended to use part of the dividend to cover estate taxes and personal guarantees. That meant he had attempted to use corporate reserves to solve a private liquidity problem. Camille performed better, but the foundation transactions trapped her. She claimed her development interest was too indirect to require disclosure. Records showed she had negotiated the investment personally. She denied leaking stories about me until her publicist's invoices appeared in Discovery, including a line item labeled Trustee Pressure Campaign. The judge upheld the trust in full. She also referred portions of the testimony and audit to regulators. Outside court, Adrian finally dropped the performance. He followed me into a private corridor and asked whether humiliating him had made me feel whole. The question revealed how little he understood. In his mind, any consequence imposed on him had to be about my emotions. Employees, lenders, safety rules, and fiduciary obligations were scenery in a drama where he remained the main character. I told him I had not made him sign the dividend resolution, hide his interest in a supplier, or lie under oath. I had only stopped cleaning up the distance between his actions and their results. He said our parents had been right about me. For the first time, that sentence did not hurt. With the trust confirmed, the stewardship panel faced a harder question: what to do with Vale Meridian? We could enforce the entire note immediately, likely pushing the company into restructuring. We could remove the board and attempt a turnaround. We could approve a sale to one of several strategic buyers, protecting some jobs but eliminating others. Every path carried losses. Revenge offered simple answers. Stewardship did not. I spent 3 months visiting facilities without press. The original factory needed modernization, but its workforce had knowledge no spreadsheet captured. The research campus remained strong. Several overseas divisions were profitable. The main weakness was not the business, it was the layer of family extraction wrapped around it. Lena proposed a restructuring that would separate ownership from management, sell the aircraft and unused residences, cancel related party contracts, and use the proceeds to repair the pension fund. Bell Industrial would extend the debt over 15 years at a reduced rate if Vale Meridian adopted an independent board, employee representation, and permanent safety oversight. The original factory would remain open with new investment. Non-core luxury assets from my parents' estate could be sold to address tax liabilities and restitution claims. The plan preserved the company but destroyed the fantasy Adrian and Camille had inherited. Their shares would remain valuable if the turnaround succeeded, yet neither would control operations. Adrian would lose his executive title and face a civil claim over the supplier arrangement. Camille would repay foundation funds and surrender her board role. The Lake Estate, Manhattan apartment, aircraft interest, jewelry, and much of the art would likely be sold. They would not become poor. They would simply become people whose lifestyles had to fit the wealth they actually owned. They considered that outcome persecution. Camille requested a private meeting at our parents' lake house before it was listed. I nearly refused, then decided some endings deserved witnesses. The house had 22 rooms and almost no warmth. Designers had replaced every trace of the summers we spent there with pale stone, sculptural furniture, and surfaces too expensive to touch. My mother's closet still smelled faintly of her perfume. My father's study had been emptied by investigators. Through the windows, the lake looked exactly as it had when we were children, indifferent to ownership. Adrian and Camille waited in the dining room. Without attorneys and assistants, they looked younger and more tired. They offered a settlement. If the trust forgave the debt and approved them as permanent co-chairs, they would give me 20% of their inherited ordinary shares, withdraw all public accusations, and issue a statement acknowledging my role in identifying the valve defect. Adrian presented the proposal as a chance to reunite the family and protect our parents' legacy. The offer showed they still misunderstood what I held. They assumed everyone wanted the same thing they wanted: more shares, a corrected public image, and a seat closer to power. I asked them whether either had read the names of the employees whose pensions would have been affected by the factory sale. Adrian said leadership could not be sentimental. I asked Camille whether she intended to repay the foundation. She said the cultural center would have increased the value of the entire district, as though potential appreciation transformed self-dealing into charity. I realized then that no explanation could reach them because misunderstanding was useful. If they admitted the issue was conduct, they would have to change. If they called it revenge, they could remain innocent victims of my bitterness. I rejected the offer. Camille's composure broke. She accused me of waiting our entire life for the chance to stand above her. She listed every advantage she believed I had taken from the family: education, travel, introductions, the Vale name on my early resume. She was not wrong that I had benefited. None of us grew up without privilege. The difference was that she believed privilege converted every later demand into a debt of obedience. I told her gratitude did not require fraud. Adrian asked what I wanted. I said I wanted the restructuring agreement signed. I wanted the foundation repaid. I wanted both of them to cooperate with investigators and stop using our parents' deaths as permission to continue their habits. Beyond that, I wanted nothing from them. He looked almost offended by the possibility that my life no longer revolved around being accepted by him. The agreement was signed 2 weeks later because lenders supported it, and the estate could not withstand a prolonged fight. Adrian resigned from every Vale Meridian position. Camille stepped down from the foundation. The board added independent directors, including a workforce representative elected by employees. Lena became chief executive under a 5-year contract with performance and safety conditions that applied regardless of her last name, which was exactly the point. The asset sales became public and produced another wave of headlines. Commentators described the collapse of a dynasty. Photographs showed auction staff carrying paintings out of the Manhattan apartment. The lake house sold to a conservation nonprofit that planned to use part of the property as a public retreat. The company aircraft went to a medical transport provider. Adrian moved into a large but ordinary house outside Columbus. Camille sold the Saint-Tropez investment before closing and rented an apartment in London. They still possessed more wealth than most people would earn in several lifetimes, yet family friends spoke of them as if they had been thrown into the street. That distortion taught me something about abundance. Once people build identity around excess, sufficiency feels like deprivation. Regulators eventually reached settlements rather than criminal charges. Adrian paid penalties, surrendered profits connected to the supplier, and accepted a multi-year ban from serving as an officer of a public company. Camille repaid the foundation with interest and was barred from managing charitable assets. Several former directors resigned. Vale Meridian recovered funds from insurers and related parties. No single courtroom scene delivered justice. Real consequences arrived through tedious documents, negotiated payments, lost titles, and doors that stopped opening. It was less dramatic than revenge stories suggest, and more permanent. My own inheritance changed my life quietly. I used part of the $18 million to pay every member of my consulting firm a retention bonus and establish a reserve that allowed us to take whistleblower cases at reduced fees. I funded a legal clinic for engineers and compliance officers facing retaliation. I kept my townhouse. I kept June. I did not buy a yacht, a penthouse, or a new identity. I also created a scholarship in grandfather's name for students combining engineering with ethics or public policy. The first recipients visited the original factory during its modernization. Watching them ask questions beneath the steel beams Arthur had once inspected, I understood that legacy could be a verb rather than a monument. The company recovered more slowly. There were difficult quarters, layoffs in 2 administrative divisions, and 1 product line we could not save. I received angry letters from people affected by those decisions. Some criticism was fair. Stewardship did not make me automatically correct, and grandfather's trust did not transform judgment into certainty. We published annual reports explaining the trust's votes, safety performance, executive compensation, and workforce investment. I insisted the reports include failures, not only achievements. The first time a communications executive suggested softening a paragraph about a missed emissions target, the entire room went quiet. Everyone knew the history. I left the paragraph intact. 2 years after my parents' deaths, Vale Meridian restored its credit rating and posted stable growth. Warranty claims fell. The pension fund reached full funding ahead of schedule. The original factory hired apprentices for the first time in a decade. Lena received industry awards and refused every interview question that tried to reduce the turnaround to a family feud. Adrian sent me a message after the earnings report. It contained no apology. He wrote that the results proved the company had always been strong and suggested the worst conflict might have been avoided if I had trusted him from the beginning. I did not answer. Camille contacted me months later after giving birth to a daughter. Her message was different. She said motherhood had made her think about the ways our parents turned affection into competition. She did not excuse her actions, but she did not fully name them either. She asked whether we might meet someday. I agreed to coffee with conditions. No publicists, no requests about the company, and no rewriting the past. The meeting was awkward and incomplete. She apologized for the campaign against me and for the foundation transactions. When I asked about the $1 letter, she admitted our mother had shown it to both siblings before signing the will. Adrian approved. Camille said nothing. Silence had always been her preferred form of participation. She cried when she acknowledged that. I did not comfort her immediately. Forgiveness offered too quickly can become another way of protecting people from the full weight of what they did. Eventually, I told her I was willing to see whether she could become someone safe to know. That was not reconciliation. It was a door unlocked, but not opened. We met 4 more times that year. She never asked for money or influence. She began working with an ordinary museum fundraising team, where financial controls prevented her from treating charity as an extension of herself. Whether the change would last, I did not know. Trust grows in small deposits and disappears in large withdrawals. I had learned to watch the balance. Adrian remained distant. He gave interviews about rebuilding after family betrayal, carefully avoiding statements that violated our settlement. Perhaps he believed his version. People rarely experience themselves as villains. He started a consulting company advising heirs of family businesses, which would have been funny if it were not so predictable. I stopped monitoring him. The dollar remained in the inner pocket of the black coat I wore to the will reading. For a while, I kept it as proof that I had won. Later, that meaning embarrassed me. Winning still placed my parents at the center, as if my worth had risen only because grandfather's inheritance outweighed their rejection. The truth was that the dollar had never measured me. Neither had the trust. If Arthur had left me nothing, my decision about the faulty valves would still have been right. My consulting practice, my friendships, and the quiet home I built would still have mattered. Money changed the scale on which I could act, but it did not retroactively create my value. That was the mistake my entire family had made, assuming wealth did not merely reveal power, but bestowed worth. On the 3rd anniversary of grandfather's death, I took the dollar to the factory. The old lobby had been renovated, but we preserved one brick wall bearing faded pencil marks from the first construction crew. Beside it stood a new exhibit telling the company's actual history. Arthur Bell was identified as inventor, landowner, and original financier. My parents were credited for expanding the business globally, along with a factual account of later governance reforms. History did not need to erase their achievements to tell the truth about their failures. Employees had contributed objects to the display: an early compressor plate, union cards, safety goggles, product sketches, photographs from night shifts and retirement parties. The company was no longer presented as something a single family had created through brilliance. It was shown as the accumulated work of thousands. I placed my parents' dollar inside the exhibit. The curator mounted it beneath a copy of the safety charter. The label did not mention the will or our family dispute. It read, "Value is determined by what we protect." That sentence belonged to no one person. Grandfather had expressed versions of it, and I had lived the cost before understanding the lesson. At the exhibit opening, Rosa Delgado brought her granddaughter, one of the new engineering apprentices. Lena stood beside former factory managers who had once feared Adrian. Miriam came carrying the leather ledger, now preserved in an archival case. Camille attended quietly and left before the photographers arrived. Adrian did not come. I looked around the lobby and thought about the conference room where my mother's final letter had been read. She intended $1 to make me small in front of witnesses. She believed inheritance was the last word a parent could speak, and that wealth gave that word authority. But wills distribute property, not truth. My parents left Adrian and Camille houses, shares, art, and the consequences hidden beneath them. Grandfather left me money, but more importantly, he left a structure that prevented any one person's appetite from consuming everyone else's future. Even that was not the thing they never expected. What they never expected was that I would use the power without becoming them. I could have forced the company into bankruptcy, stripped my siblings' shares, and sold the land for more than the trust's appraised value. I could have turned every meeting into punishment and called it justice. People would have understood. Some would have applauded. Instead, I protected the factory, repaid the pension, exposed the fraud, and allowed my siblings to keep whatever remained after honest accounting. Mercy did not mean shielding them from consequences. It meant refusing to manufacture extra suffering simply because I finally had the authority. That distinction became grandfather's true inheritance. Years later, people still sometimes ask how it felt to discover I had received more than the children my parents favored. They expect satisfaction, and I understand why. There was a moment in the trust reading when Adrian's face lost its certainty, and Camille realized the hierarchy of our childhood no longer had legal force. I would be lying if I said that moment held no pleasure, but pleasure passed. Responsibility stayed. The trust requires me to name a future steward based on documented conduct, not blood order. I have no children, and I do not know whether I ever will. That no longer worries me. The next steward may be a relative, an employee, or someone not yet connected to the company. They will receive no throne and no promise of love. They will receive rules, records, and the obligation to remember that ownership is not the same as possession. Every year I read my mother's letter once, not because I believe it, and not because I enjoy the pain. I read it beside the stewardship report as a private audit. Power can make anyone skilled at explaining why personal desire serves a larger good. My mother's words remind me how polished that explanation can sound. Then I read Arthur's ledger, where every promise has a date, every loan has a signature, and every boundary exists whether or not powerful people prefer to see it. One document tried to define a daughter, the other required an adult to remain accountable. I know which inheritance was worth keeping.